innovation is actually going to figure in some of our discussions today, because of course we're talking about the great intersection of two extraordinary industries that powered 20th century American greatness and that now stand at a crossroads, the energy industry and the automobile industry. And where these two come together, a marriage, a symbiosis that's lasted over a century, we ask the question now, is the marriage headed for divorce? Is there something after oil? Or will our gasoline, which energy experts like to say is the best substitute for gasoline is gasoline. It's what the old guys in the industry like to say because of its energy density. It's quite good at what it does. Will it be more long-lived than we might wish, given some of its environmental or security implications? These are tough questions. These are not easy questions. But we have with us the good fortune to have not one, but two both leading experts, but also leading doers, cabinet secretaries from President Obama's administration. To my right, Transport Secretary Ray LaHood, and to my immediate right, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. So give them a round of applause for joining us this morning. Now, if you cast our mind back over a century, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was an important gathering of the world's leading environment and energy experts. And they were asked, what is the most important pollution problem? And bear in mind, by this time, the internal combustion engine had been invented and was readily available. Gasoline was readily available. But they voted. Can anyone guess what they voted at the turn of that century? You can shout it out. You got it, exactly, horse manure. Because even though the horseless carriage was readily apparent in front of them in increasing numbers, Henry Ford was just around the corner, the leading experts of the day on the environment said the problem is horse manure and the related problem of dead horses. The American cities were littered with that because the horse and buggy was still the dominant means of conveyance. And they couldn't look just a decade or two beyond to see the extraordinary disruptive innovation that was already at hand. And so I say this anecdote to point out that forecasting the future of transport can be a tricky business. But nevertheless, we have two wonderful experts who are gamely willing to jump in. So in that spirit, let me ask perhaps Secretary LaHood first. The internal combustion engine has been around, as I've mentioned, for nearly a century and a half. It's powered American greatness in many ways. Manifest destiny, I call it manifold destiny, in a sense, freedom to roam the American highways. Yes, I know, I apologize for that pun. But let's cast our gaze to the future. Let's step back from the immediacy of what's possible in Washington today and the practicalities. If we were to look at, say, 2030, a reasonable planning horizon, I'm not saying 2100, 100 years, but 2030, what's your forecast for best case and worst case for the share held by gasoline in the new car fleet of 2030?
One of the first executive orders that President Obama signed within 30 days of being sworn in the presence of both Administrator Jackson and myself, was an executive order to raise CAFE standards, to raise gasoline standards for light trucks and automobiles. And I don't know, Lisa probably knew what impact that was going to have. I certainly didn't. But over the last 3.5 years, we have developed an opportunity for car manufacturers to have certainty in the manufacture of cars with respect to the kind of gasoline standards they will get. And this goes to the point of that you can talk about these things, but implementing them is more difficult. There was not one vote of Congress on this. This was done by executive order. So by, let's see, 2025, cars and light trucks will get around 36 miles per gallon. By, let's see, 2025, cars and light trucks will get 54.4 miles per gallon. Now, no one ever dreamed that that could happen. And it's really just simply because of leadership in Washington. And the other thing that people said could not happen is that the EPA and the Department of Transportation could make this happen, and that you could get every car manufacturer in the world to agree to it. But on 2 different occasions, when the President announced this, we had every CEO of every car manufacturer in the world there. And because of the many, many smart people at the EPA and our people at DOT working together over the last 3.5 years, we will have people driving automobiles that will get extraordinarily high gas mileage and save a lot of CO2 and clean up the air and have clean burning fuel.
Is that a way of saying that all the cars may still be running gasoline, but that they'll use a lot less of it?
I think the one thing that we didn't know 3.5 years ago that we know today is that we were going to have an abundance of natural gas. And nobody really knows at this point. I was in Carbondale yesterday, Carbondale, Colorado, helping inaugurate a bus rapid transit system. All of the buses will be fueled by natural gas. 3.5 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about that. So that part of it is a new dimension that we really don't know. And so things are moving quickly. I guess that's the best way to put it. Not only because of the President's vision and our ability, people, I think, should know that our ability the ability of government officials at the direction of the President to be able to do what we did is just quite extraordinary.
So we'll drill down into CAFE in just a little bit and cover that in some detail because it's very important to the story. But just to give people the big picture perspective, you've highlighted that the incumbent isn't standing still. That is, thanks to the efforts that your 2 agencies have made, we're going to see dramatic improvements in fuel economy over that time period. You've also identified that probably for fleets first, we're going to see natural gas penetration, propelled by the fact that we have an extraordinary natural gas bounty here in North America that wasn't anticipated. A lot of people have been enthusiastic about electricity as a possible fuel, as an energy carrier. Now, we all know electricity is not a primary fuel. It has to be made from something, right? So you have to say that up front. It's not a like-for-like substitute. You need to make it from something, and it matters whether you make it from renewables or from coal, because your environmental profile obviously changes. But nevertheless, the electrification of the vehicle, of electric drive or even partial through hybridization and so on, appears to be a really big trend. I wondered if either of you would comment on what is the prospect for this area that has a lot of enthusiasm.
Well, I think, and it's sort of in answer to your first question as well, we're at a moment where the answer to your first question is entirely dependent on the answer to your second question in a way, which is, will the electric engine take root in the American car buying psyche? And I have no doubt that it's already taken root in the American car manufacturing psyche. But they're in the business of selling cars, so they're going to make what the American people want to buy. And I'm being purposely domestically focused for just a second because still the American auto buying public have a huge say in what the world auto buying public will look at. That's changing, but and if you disagree, please let me know. So I think that yes, part of the reason I think that is actually the lessons of my own home. I have 2 sons, but one who wants to be a mechanical engineer, and he. When he talks and goes around and visits schools and looks, he only wants to see places that are working on gee whiz cool stuff, because that's what mechanical engineers want to do. They're gearheads, right? And the gee whiz cool stuff he wants to talk about are the cars and vehicles and planes. He's a big plane kid of the future. And so I think what we have to ask ourselves is, for kids who came up with electric-powered vehicles, kind of part of their psyche. You know, they all had, if affluent kids, but they had little things they could plug into the wall and drive around since they were little. How are they going to feel about a car that their main fueling is to plug in? How do they feel about something like the Volt or the Leaf. And I think that's really important. So I actually believe that the technology is not going to be the limiting factor in any way. I totally believe that the storage issues are going to be fine within the next 10 years. But at the end of the day, in a free enterprise system, it's all about what the market wants, and that will drive the penetration of electricity. I should give a special shout out to California, because I think they will also, as they have in the 40 years of the Clean Air Act and before, help to move this country into doing and imagining the things that Curmudgeon said could not be done. And so part of it will be whether and how California moves from a regulatory perspective to deal with what are very present and real air pollution problems from the internal combustion engine.
Well, you make a really good point. Of course, the profound observation you make that ultimately consumers will choose, right? If you make cars that are unattractive, no matter how virtuous they are, people won't buy them. And people who make more practical or more fun cars are historically have won out. Right, but there is still, I think, since we have two policymakers at the table, the role for policy, I think, given that in the area of energy, environment, and transportation, what economists like to call externalities are so powerful. That is, the tailpipe emission that comes out of your SUV when you drove here this morning, the cost of that is primarily borne by somebody else. It's not borne by you inside your car, it's borne by the child who's standing on the street corner. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, it may be borne by your own grandchildren or people in Bangladesh, because the discontinuities of time and space and how climate change affects people. And so there has always been a rigorous case, even free market economists. I mean, I write for a free market magazine, The Economist, and nearly 15 years ago, I wrote editorials arguing the case for externalities policies, like carbon taxes or trading systems and so on. I think most reasonable people acknowledge there's a role for government in this area. If we're talking about dealing with tailpipe emissions in Californian cities, do you see a role for the federal government also to be involved in some of those externalities? Because that will influence choices for example, zero-emission vehicles, be they electric or some distant day hydrogen fuel cells. Those vehicles are zero pollution at the point of use. There may be pollution from a coal plant somewhere else, but in that city that's concerned about smog, it will be considered a zero-emission vehicle. Is there a case, or do you think that oversteps what the federal government should do?
I have to answer first, Ray. Sorry. A resounding yes. And resounding because there's so many people out there arguing that somehow the market can take care of this. And you put the economics case right out there. This is an externality paid for by others. If the government doesn't say there are certain goods, clean air being one of them, energy security being another one, the security of our country, our national security, which is so deeply tied to energy security, our ability to innovate and grow GDP, and to the extent that transportation in that sector, which was such a huge, sort of energy writ large, so forgive me, was such a huge driver of GDP, do we see it, and how do we see it as a driver of GDP as we imagine the economy of the future? Aren't those all questions that a nation's government should be asking? Certainly national defense is. No one ever argues that that one of the fundamental roles of a federal government is national defense. I would argue, you know, I'm head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and I always say to people, it's not an accident that protection's in the name. In some ways, it's a defense agency. That would make some people's head explode in Washington, I'm fairly sure.
But it might increase your budget.
Yeah, okay, so we're the Environmental Defense Agency. But listen, you know, if it's not the federal government's job to say one of the things we're going to do is protect the quality of air and water and land for future generations, because we see it as absolutely tied. It's one of the bounties of this country, and why should we give up that strategic advantage, and why should we make our people sick in order to get wealthier? Then I think, of course, you see a role for it. And I think Ray did such a lovely job in the beginning explaining the president's foresight. I have been working in the environmental field for longer than I should remember, almost 30 years, getting there. And I could not envision a day where there would be the foresight on day one for the president to say, you know what, the most important thing for our auto industry, besides helping them financially, is that they have one set of standards that will guide their market movement and innovation over the next decade. That's what they have right now. So the answer has to be yes. Otherwise, why are we in this space, and why do we not see, why are we seeing the resurgence of the industry around a set of principles so that they can compete still with each other, but they don't have to worry that as soon as they design a car, California or New Jersey or the federal government are going to say it doesn't meet standards.
Mr. Secretary? Eloquently put, I think, is what he's saying, yes. You know, we've already touched on this, but sort of one more question on how we think about this problem before we delve right into some very important issues of CAFE, an important court case that came up recently we'll talk about. You know, the government has always played a powerful role in encouraging transportation, for example, by building the national highway system. This has been seen as part of the backbone of America, as something that will help fuel the economy going forward, and a justified role for government. I know we've just passed the transport bill. I can see your faces a little bit relieved, perhaps compared to where it might have been a week or two ago. But in the digital age, if we think of sustainable mobility rather than just transportation as the key, what's the right role for government? How should policy evolve?
Can you unpack sustainable mobility?
Well, I mean, we've talked about sustainability as an issue, which would involve both environmental components, economic components, perhaps even access components. We talked about security, something you put on the table a minute ago. And mobility tries to get away from the idea that it has to be a particular mode that we have. You know, Americans, we love cars. I grew up with cars. It's the only way that many parts of the country, the easiest mode to get around. But is one-size-fits-all vehicle in North Dakota in the middle of winter that might need to have a certain degree of robustness the only way to move around in major metros where there might be multiple options, where public transport might be more economic? So as we think about mobility, getting from point A to point B, I think when people really think about transportation, most people, most of the time, actually want to get to where they're going in a pleasant way. Much as when people think about energy, the famous energy thinker Amory Lovins, who lives up in Snowmass around the corner, likes to say what people really care about is cold beer and hot showers. Nobody cares about electrons. I mean, ordinary people don't, except, I mean, you folks are special. You got up at 6 in the morning to come here for an 8 o'clock talk. You're already self-selected. But most ordinary people, your neighbors, they don't think about what is the exact kilowatt usage and where's this coal, how desulfurizes it. You know, they want cold beer, they want hot showers, energy services. And in that spirit, I think most ordinary people care about mobility and will look at the options in front of them going forward. I wonder, is there something there for new business models, new ways of doing this, and what might be the role of government in encouraging that?
Well, look, for the last 3.5 years, what we've done at DOT with our partners around the country is try and figure out what is the best mode of transportation for people in communities. So we've worked closely with mayors, city planners, county officials, governors. And what we've figured out is that we know that people are always going to have an automobile. There'll always be a place for the automobile in America. But most Americans now are looking for other forms of transportation. Our investments over the last 3.5 years have been in streetcars, light rail, walking and biking paths, investing in communities and transportation that people in communities really want. People want alternatives. We're never going to eliminate the car. We have the best interstate system in the world. We've built it. We built it over 50 years. Our goal now at DOT is to talk about the next generation of transportation for the next generation. Not really for those of us in this audience, but for our children and grandchildren. What are we going to leave for them? In America, in transportation, we have always been about what are we going to do for the next generation? The previous generations built the interstate system. What we're doing, what our goal at DOT for the next generation is high-speed rail, light rail, streetcars, walking and biking paths. And even though the transportation bill that passed, and we're glad it did because it'll provide thousands of jobs for Americans, is a little bit highway-centric, it will not dissuade us from the vision that we have an obligation to leave the next generation of transportation. And it won't be an interstate system. It'll be alternatives in communities for people to get around. No one would have ever dreamed a year ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago that Carbondale, Colorado would be developing a bus system that will be powered by natural gas. That would not have been thought about even 2 years ago. But because the abundance of it is now the game changer as a fuel, a lot of communities are going to be thinking about that. And that's what we celebrated in Carbondale, Colorado yesterday. Not only a bus system for an entire region that will deliver people who don't want to drive their cars, but powered by natural gas. That's what we're doing for the next generation.
You know, I want to brag on Ray for a second, because here's the Secretary of Transportation who within a couple of months came to the head of the EPA, and I'm still embarrassed about this moment, said, let's talk about doing a partnership for sustainable development to help communities that are trying to make decisions like Carbondale just made about transportation and about housing, but want to do it in a way that's mindful of future generations. And so we have a partnership for sustainable communities. Ray brings the money. I bring the technical expertise. No, just kidding. Ray and DOT and HUD, who have huge federal levers in terms of thinking about housing and thinking about transportation and working with communities. And EPA can often help more on the side of quantifying what are you saving? What energy, what air pollution, how are you impacting water quality? What do those issues mean? And we're working in communities. We were in Denver once together. We went to Iowa. And that's a fun and interesting partnership. Now, there's a place, to your earlier question, where you could have a critic say, what in the world is the federal government doing in communities talking about sustainable mobility, to use your term, and sustainable housing? But it's voluntary. That's answer number one. And these are communities who shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel of thinking about those issues, no matter how big or small they are. You can see a Chicago or a New York or a New Orleans thinking about those issues, but a smaller community might need some help. And the one thing they definitely need is a federal government that's trying to help them support the vision they have, not a cookie-cutter vision. And so I just have to salute Ray's foresight in realizing that that's a huge part of the puzzle. Only other thing I want to say, totally off message, but back to your original question, is I don't think we should underestimate different delivery methods for automobile transportation. Yes, automobiles are going to be around, and I know the folks who sell them are going to get annoyed with me, but you know, whether you're talking about the zip card type models or other models that are about putting mobility at the fingertips in a society that's, I guess the term, the mesh society is, one author uses it, the ability to get what I need, when I need it, where I need it, may make the auto model, sure, everybody might have one, more people might have one, but they might not own them.
I don't think the car manufacturers would be manufacturing the cars they're manufacturing today as hybrids if it weren't for what the president did in signing the executive order and what Lisa and I have done over the last 3.5 years about developing CAFE standards for automobiles and light trucks that'll get 54.4 miles per gallon.
Well, let's just talk about that.
I think we have jump-started the ability. I mean, when you see now a Lexus hybrid, no one would have ever predicted that 2 years ago. Every car manufacturer is getting into hybrid. I think we jump-started those opportunities.
Well, I mean, the president has announced his intention to finalize by August, I believe, important greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards for new passenger vehicles. And these would, I think, in effect double the nation's fuel economy performance for new cars to above 50. I think the number you cited was higher than 50 by 50 miles per gallon by 2025. Is this on track? We're not hearing a lot about it lately.
It's on track. It'll be done.
It'll be done. You're just keeping a low profile in the media about it.
Well, we're talking about it here today. We talk about it a lot. Whether the media picks up on it or not, it's not as sexy as some of these other things that the media. You know, if we could control what the media wrote about, they'd be writing a lot more about CAFE standards.
I stand corrected. So the policy is on track. You heard it here. That's great.
Except I think it's September.
September. Okay, we'll allow that month extra. Let's talk about an important court decision that came. It was obviously overshadowed to some degree by the healthcare court decision, but in some ways, the impact of this could be just as big. Just for those of you who didn't catch it in the news, last week the U.S. Court of Appeal upheld the EPA's finding that greenhouse gases are a danger to public health and welfare. It's known as the endangerment finding, and called it, in very strong language, in fact, unambiguously correct, and rejected the legal challenges brought by some 100 entities, corporations, among them states, including Texas. But this was a very forceful ruling. It wasn't ambivalent or divided in the court. Can you tell us, Administrator Jackson, the implications of this? I see a big smile on your face. I think that's the first implication.
Yeah, so the first implication is some small amount of gratification, because we have, I have to unpack that just a second. Why is a court ruling so important? So EPA's work, our work with Ray on CAFE standards, all of our work in the greenhouse gas space is being done under, obviously, federal law. That's what authorizes us to work. And the law we're using is the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act has a provision that says if a pollutant is found to endanger public health and welfare, then EPA must, not can, EPA must act to address it. It's under that kind of authority that we've dealt with everything from lead in gasoline and automobile emissions to acid rain, sulfur dioxide, through mainly a cap and trade type model program, to smog pollution, and have had incredible success. Air pollution's down 50% in the 41 years of EPA's existence. We still have huge challenges, especially in localized areas. So the endangerment finding, making a finding, which EPA did at the end of 2009, and which I should note had been worked on for many years before that and bottled up. So one of the things that I was most proud to do was to put that science out for public comment and then finalize it with the staff at EPA, and having the court say that we had used good science and that the record supported that finding was one, it felt good as a scientist for all that work, but it also allows us, it requires us to use the Clean Air Act to start to reduce greenhouse gases. And I've said, and this has been, to me, a legitimate point of contention, well, you can start almost anywhere. We all exhale greenhouse gases. That's how we get people saying we're going to tax your breathing. We are not. Our animals are, especially cows, and are large sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and so that's how we got the rumor of the cow tax. We're not. But we are going to look, what I said, is at the big emission sources in our economy. The first is the first is usually the generation of electricity through power plants, and the second is often how we get around our cars and trucks and other.
So let's talk about the power sector, right? It's in many ways the big kahuna. If I'm not mistaken, I think the EPA has proposed national emission standards for new power plants.
That's right.
What about the existing stock of clunkers? I mean, the American power sector is more than 50% coal still, I believe, after, has that been reduced due to plants going offline? But it's substantially coal, and not young plants either. What's the plan for dealing with the existing base of power plants?
So of course that's important because coal, uncontrolled CO2 emissions from coal are the highest. The most carbon CO2 intense form of power generation is the burning of that particular fossil fuel. When you switch to something like natural gas, you get a bump 30, 40% right off the bat, provided you're sensible and reasonable and careful and not leaking natural gas all over the place when you're drilling for it and producing it and transmitting it, which we also have standards now in place for across the country, working with the natural gas producers. So the reason I said no is that, yes, it's true. Probably at the turn of this decade, maybe a little before, coal was about 50% of our energy mix. That's been gradually coming down. We're somewhere around 40%, I do believe, and projections are that we'll be in the 30s by 2030, and maybe less than that. But I think that's where our EIA is right now, the Energy Information Administration. So the rules were intended to do one thing. Remember being reasonable and sensible. You can imagine that for coal-producing states and people who are working in that industry, there cannot be one day we just turn off these plants. There's huge problems for the people employed in that industry, but there's also concerns about reliability in the electricity grid. This is an abundant source. It is an abundant fossil fuel still in our country. And so what we thought we should do first is send a strong signal about future plants, those that are in the pipeline for being built. And so what the standards propose, and they're still out for proposal, so I cannot talk about them as though they're final. We propose a standard, we take public comment, and then we finalize sometime later this year, is that those new power plants emit no more than 1,000 pounds of CO2 or CO2 equivalents per megawatt hour. And that's a standard that's met by natural gas, but needs to have control on a coal-fired power plant. And the control that most people talk about is capturing carbon and sequestering it underground. And so what we've had people say is, well, you're giving us a standard that's not commercially available. So what we did in the rule is propose a 10-year process by which if you still want to build a coal-fired power plant, you have to, before you can get a permit, this is a proposal, say within 10 years I'm going to turn on a CCS system and it's going to operate. So you can average your emissions over the life of the plant, but it gives, hopefully, a technological bump towards making sure that the CCS technology is going to be available and you're going to be able to sequester half of that carbon dioxide. The reason that standard costs this, $0. And the reason is because every projection of new bills for power in our country does not include coal new builds. Partially, mostly because natural gas is now so much cheaper as a baseload source of power than coal. And doesn't come with the emissions issues. You don't need to build nearly as much back-end control technology to deal with things like sulfur dioxide or particulate matter, soot, fine particles. So the rules really take advantage of where the market was already. We're not stopping anyone, and we did include those few plants that are in the pipeline. We actually said, listen, identify yourselves, and if you have a permit, you're going to be able to go forward, because those would be sunk costs as well. So that's where we started. You asked about existing. Sorry for the long answer. But I have said, and I continue to believe that, well, we don't have plans on the existing plants right now. I really believe that we're taking some pretty big sort of stepwise motions, and the car rules are another one. So most Americans don't realize that in our country, we regulate the amount of greenhouse gas that can come out of your tailpipe. And we're going to regulate it for the next 10 years. We don't do fuel economy at EPA. That's entirely DOT. So everything you hear about 55 miles per gallon is because of DOT. It's EPA who comes behind and says, and here's how much carbon you can release into the atmosphere. That includes out of the tailpipe and a powerful greenhouse gas, or the refrigerants, as you know, used in cars. So a car maker can build a really tight refrigeration system and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a combination of both.
Great. Now, I'm going to turn to the audience for your questions, so please get your thoughts. And let's also get the microphone runners here. Meanwhile, let me, while people collect their thoughts, ask a quick question to Secretary LaHood. We had heard about Administrator Jackson's mechanical engineering son. As a Mechie myself by training, I appreciate his love of cool things like cars and planes. So, well, let's veer a little bit off topic, but talk a little bit about planes, but also in the context of our conversation. There is a global conflict brewing over greenhouse gases and air travel. As you will know, the European Commission has imposed an emissions trading system for greenhouse gases. That's now the law of the land in Europe. American carriers are very unhappy with this, as are carriers in China, where I reside, and India, some other countries are opposed to this. It's become a standoff. I want to ask the Secretary, what's your plan to resolve this? Just a point of clarification, the European Commission says that American carriers that fly to Europe will be measured on all the miles from flying from America, not just the bit over European airspace. That's been a bone of contention, but a challenge in Europe, a legal challenge, was lost by American carriers, so the Europeans have the legal high ground in Europe.
The European Union passed a law putting a tax on airlines for the emission of carbons flying in and out of Europe. Our disagreement with that is that, number one, what we said is we take a backseat to no one when it comes to the environment, cleaning up the environment, environmental standards. Number two, what we believe the European Union should have done is dealt with this issue the way that most people deal with issues. Get everybody around the table, figure out the solution, and then adopt the solution. But to arbitrarily just pass a law that puts a tax on airlines flying in and out of Europe doesn't seem to be the friendly way, the good way, the collaborative way to implement this scheme. And so our objection really is the idea that one level of government or one form of government, i.e. the European Union, passes a law, puts a tax on airlines with no collaboration, no discussion, and we just...
On the collaboration point, I know, Administrator, you want to jump in, but is there a plan to get the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is an umbrella body that
we're in
is
favor
involved?
of ICAO, which is the international organization. We're in favor of them addressing the issue, and I've talked to the head of ICAO about this.
So a resolution there would be acceptable to American
airlines? The proper thing to do would be to get everybody at the table and have a discussion, and then we'll see where the resolution takes us.
Right. Okay, please.
And the only thing I wanted to jump in and say is practically the irony maybe of their approach is I was just recently in Seattle. You can't go to Seattle without visiting Boeing. And you can't be the mother of a burgeoning Emmy without wanting to see the Dreamliner and all the amazing technology that they're actually now turning out, you know, by the hour out there and in other parts of the world. Here's an American airline, right, the manufacturer whose business model is energy efficiency, right? It's kind of the disconnect in our system. Their customers know that the number one cost for them to do business is flying the plane, the fuel. So anything they can do to make their plane more fuel efficient means you can make longer hops, you can re-envision your whole itinerary, your map. So that's how they're going to make money, and they're selling planes. So we're not talking about a country that doesn't have innovators who are looking at ways to absolutely reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But you didn't bring them to the table or the government to the table in a way that would have spurred that. Totally the opposite approach of automobiles in a way, right? The auto standards were not set in a vacuum. The process, which is pretty amazing to see, requires some pretty intense work together with the industry. So that's the irony of it.
Well, as you say, the new generation of planes coming out is dramatically more efficient than the oldest. If we were to just replace the clunkers, the worst 20% of planes out there with the newer generation, you would do much more than even the European standards or others would do. But the reason I bring it up is there is a risk of a possible trade war. And so hopefully we'll be able to resolve this in an international way. I see a gentleman there. We'll come to you, sir, and we'll cross over to the other side next. Please identify yourself.
My name's Shelley Don. I'm an attorney here in Denver. I'm just wondering, given the political nature of the court decision that you have just been the beneficiary of, and the court's decision in the Health Care Act, what's your take on what the Supreme Court will do when your case gets there?
Well, I'm not an attorney, as you are, sir, so, and I don't want to tempt fate, so I'm knocking on wood. But I don't believe the decision was political. I do believe it was fairly scathing. It was pretty broad-based, and it was a pretty broad-based repudiation of almost all counts, not every single count. In the case of the tailoring rule, there was issues of standing, which also came into play. The court, the district court in D.C. is not a stranger to writing decisions and being very clear how they feel about something. This is the court that's ruled on some of the Bush administration rules that we had to redo. They called them Alice in Wonderland. They equated it to Humpty Dumpty. This ruling, in my heart, will forever be known as the ruling where in the actual ruling they cite Schoolhouse Rock. And there's a link to the famous Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. Because they're talking about the likelihood of a greenhouse gas energy law in our country, which of course our president championed, but couldn't get through Congress. So it's a pretty broad-based repudiation of the endangerment finding. It supports our joint auto rules and future rules, and then it goes even further onto stationary sources. The lawyers believe that because the Supreme Court has ruled in Massachusetts versus EPA already on greenhouse gases, and then most recently, the citation escapes me, but I'm sure you know it, that there's some belief that the breadth of the ruling, combined with the fact that the Supreme Court has spoken on this twice now, may mean that we're done. And I think a lot of people believe that in Washington, although I know there's a lot of saber rattling right now going on about appeals.
A question right there. I see you have the microphone, lady with the microphone. You can go to the gentleman in blue first. All right. We'll come to you next, sir. It's all right.
My name is Raymond Learsey, and I'm just, about a week or so ago, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial that the EPA was unnecessarily intrusive and had established very difficult and unnecessary standards for the fracking of natural gas, and therefore is delaying and restraining the development of that particular form of energy for the nation. I'd like to have your comments, please.
I'm thinking. I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I skip the editorial page because I don't find it to be as well informed as other parts of the paper. Let me just say a couple things about the reality on the ground of natural gas fracking and EPA's role and the federal government's role. I'll be broader in that technology. Fracking is the process by which we have the potential for this incredible store of natural gas. And I have said and will continue to say that I believe it can be done safely, responsibly, and it must be done and should be done that way because it's really important to our country. The way to do something safely and responsibly is not to ask regulators of any stripe to go and put their heads in the sand. Fracking has the potential to have enormous impacts, the potential to have impacts on everything from the quantity of water available to the quality of waters available. And I absolutely agree that most states are more than capable, especially if they have a long history of oil and gas production, of ensuring that everything in the well drilling operation can be done safely. There's an issue on federal lands which the Department of Interior is now in the process of addressing, and that makes total sense to me. But to ask the American people to look at a technology which we have to grant is going to be used in a widespread nature across regions of our country, certainly not across the whole country, and in regions of our country where there are pretty dense population pockets, and to say, trust us, which the industry and some of its supporters seem to be saying. Trust us to make sure that the water is protected, and trust us to ensure that the air is protected without working in partnership with the agency at a minimum or with somebody, some regulators at a minimum, so that there's legitimacy to that statement, I think is short-sighted to the extreme. And I would think that whether I was the head of the EPA or working somewhere in the industry, my recommendation would still be we are better off and stronger as a country to look at this strategic resource, to say we've decided, as the president has said, that we need to get this gas out of the ground. We need to use it for everything from transportation to perhaps re-emergence of a chemical manufacturing sector to power generation, baseload power generation, transformative across our economy. But to not say in the year 2012, when we do that, we're of course going to respect that the American people need to have their questions answered fully, or they're going to be suspicious of an industry that respectfully, for all the good it's done, has also been responsible for some of the worst environmental tragedies in our country and around the world, is short-sighted and maybe a little arrogant.
We'll come to you, and then I'm going to come to the back there, where a gentleman's been very patiently waiting.
My name is Jim Horwich. There are approximately 10, and my question is directed to Secretary LaHood. There are approximately 10 million vehicles, gasoline vehicles produced each year in the United States. Those will have a life of 14 to 16 years before they're finally retired from the fleet. The only fuel available, with few exceptions, electric, a little bit of natural gas, is gasoline. There is no competition to gasoline. However, with the addition of approximately $100 at the factory, a flex fuel vehicle can be produced, which can burn gasoline, ethanol, methanol. This is being done in Brazil. The entire fleet is flex fuel.
Your question, sir.
That's my question. Why aren't we doing this in the United States?
Okay. Secretary LaHood, we are doing flex fuel, aren't we?
We are.
But please.
Well, in government, there are only certain things you can do. When we all came to these jobs 3.5 years ago, we'd have these meetings together as cabinet members. And one of the things that I said to my cabinet colleagues, look, you're not going to be able to change everything. It's too complicated. So find 2 or 3 things that you think you can get done, so when you walk out the door at the end of 4 years, or if this ends at the end of 4 years, you can say 2 or 3 things that you were able to accomplish. And Lisa and I decided, because of the president's leadership, that CAFE standards were certainly going to be one of those. Obviously, I've decided, and she has, different things for our agency. There's a limit. Look at there's a limited amount that we can do in these jobs. Part of it comes from the leadership of the president. Part of it comes from just things that we want to get done, that we've dreamed about getting done. And so what we've done on CAFE standards has never been done before. And it was done without a vote of Congress. That's pretty good. And it was done with the cooperation of every car manufacturer in the world. I think that's a pretty big achievement. Now, should we have done more on ethanol-powered, flex fuel? Yes, but we should have done more on a lot of other things. But we're operating in Washington with a Congress that wants to do nothing. If it was up to Congress, nothing would be done about almost everything. And so we're restrained by some of those things. I think we've done a lot. I think we've done a lot more than people ever thought we could do. Frankly, I think we've done a lot more than I ever thought we could do. Has it been enough? Of course not. It's never enough. We always need to do more.
Let me add an editorial thought. This is definitely not the administration's public view, but I spent a lot of time covering Latin America. I was their former bureau chief in that region, and I'm very familiar with the Brazilian case, sir, that you talk about. It is an extraordinary success story for multiple levels in having flexible fuels, but also they benefited from a natural endowment. Brazil uses sugarcane to make its ethanol, and it is a much more environmentally friendly fuel measured on carbon cycle and other things than the corn ethanol that we use in the U.S. And so we do have flex fuel cars. In fact, there were tax breaks provided by previous policies involving CAFE that encouraged manufacturers to make flex fuel vehicles, but often the people who drove them didn't know they were flex fuel, or they were in parts of the country where it wasn't readily available. And so we have a chicken and egg problem, and we have a problem of natural endowments, where we have, frankly, a relatively ungreen, my words, not theirs, corn ethanol that is not a great substitute, as is the case in Brazil, where it's supported by environmental groups. Let's get to the gentleman who's been in the back. Real quick question, sir, because we're running out of time.
Sure. So my name is Jamie Rhodes, and I've worked in climate policy community for a while. And in that community, we think about emissions from the transportation sector as coming in terms of a three-legged stool.
We're getting to a quick question, right? Because time is short.
Sure. Vehicle efficiency, vehicle miles traveled, and fuel carbon intensity. We've talked about two of them, and I wonder how if you could talk a little bit about the third.
So I'd like to talk about fuels, if it's okay, Ray. Very quickly, you said fuel carbon intensity. I want to broaden that to fuel itself. The other part of the story, the reason why we have millions more cars on the road today than when EPA came to be, and yet less pollution coming from the car population than when we started, is because cars have gotten more efficient slowly. We just took a big leap forward in 2009 and 10. And fuels have gotten so much cleaner. I think we need to continue to make fuels cleaner. I think we can get to the point where gasoline as a fuel for all other forms of pollution except for CO2 will be awfully clean. And that's really important in cities. Vijay mentioned a kid standing on a block. That's where it actually comes down to, a kid with an asthma attack on a block somewhere in a city or in a suburb. And I think we need to consider doing that in the future. Those are the tier 3 rules. In terms of carbon intensity, I know California is working on a low carbon fuel standard. There's been lots of talk about it. I would say, if you look at that 3-legged stool, we've made incredible progress on 2 of the legs. There probably needs to be a little bit of an equilibrium as we go forward, and we're going to need Congress. We're going to need some national policy on what that means. And as usual, California is doing some of the thinking for us first. But I think that's the way they've always done it and the way it's going to go.